Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Siegel, Chair and founder of Friends of Cancer Research. We're proud to welcome you to this virtual meeting Beyond Breakthrough, Optimizing Breakthrough Therapy Designation, something that we're incredibly proud of. This designation is a pivotal tool for the FDA to expedite therapies to patients, and one that is near and dear to me and Friends since its origin, and how thankful I am of all the work that Friends put into this with others to make this a reality for patients. In 2013, working with our partners in all sectors, Friends took breakthrough from a concept to scientific white paper to bipartisan legislation, to a tool in full use in just 1 year. That is remarkable and something we're incredibly proud of. In oncology, the ability to target a novel agent against key drivers of cancer has led to several therapeutic breakthroughs in serious life-threatening disease with limited or no treatment option for patients. These breakthroughs have established new classes of therapeutics and leading to some instances transformative results. The success of this program is clear in the numbers. FDA has granted over 450 designations, approved 218 products that received a breakthrough designation. On average, these products had notably shorter development times. I don't have to tell anyone how important that is to a patient. While this program has been invaluable in advancing oncology based on a decade of experience, there are opportunities for improvement. And that is why we are here today, to make sure this program continues to be a catalyst for improving the lives of patients everywhere. Thank you for attending today, and I now have the honor to introduce a tireless champion for patients, a champion for science, and the original sponsor of the bill that made breakthrough law, Senator Michael Bennet. How proud we are of you, Senator, and how important this legislation has been. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Bennet, and I represent Colorado in the U.S. Senate. I'm thrilled to be with you today to open this meeting on breakthrough therapies. First, I want to thank Friends of Cancer Research for their tireless work on behalf of patients, families, and anyone affected by cancer. Nearly a decade ago, Friends of Cancer Research brought the idea of breakthrough therapies to me and helped us craft a proposal to address the problem. As evidenced by this gathering, they continue to lead the way by working to improve the healthcare system so that more Americans can access life-saving drugs and therapies. In 2012, I introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah and Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina to establish the breakthrough designation at the FDA. Prior to introducing our bill, I had heard from countless patients and developers and researchers about the need for certainty in the FDA approval process. We were seeing major breakthroughs in drugs and treatments for debilitating and terminal diseases, but they were not always getting to patients safely and efficiently. It was clear that we needed to modernize the system to keep up with 21st century cures and technology. And for Americans battling cancer and other diseases, this was a matter of life and death. We hope that passing the breakthrough therapy designation into law would make treatments more readily available for patients. What we did not anticipate was how significant the program would be. Within the first year of the bill's implementation, the FDA received over 100 applications and granted 37 breakthrough designations. That year, during a visit to Colorado Children's Hospital, I met a 7-year-old with cystic fibrosis named Caleb. At the time, he had a life expectancy of 35 years. When I met Caleb, he told me about a drug that had greatly improved his quality of life. He was now able to play soccer and basketball, baseball with other kids his age. That drug was one of the first 2 breakthrough therapies that the FDA approved. And just this year, the FDA has approved 2 breakthrough drugs to treat different cancers, as well as a vaccine to prevent a difficult type of pneumonia. Breakthrough therapies have brought hope to so many Americans and their loved ones. But there's still more work to do to ensure the FDA and developers can improve the approval process to bring more life-saving products to market. And we need to minimize barriers to access, including lowering the cost of these therapies and ensuring that patients can access them no matter where they live. I know these challenges have brought you together today, and I'm grateful that everyone from patient advocates to the FDA and industry have come together to work on the best path forward. Thank you for being here, and I wish you the best of luck as you work toward improving the system to treat the most difficult diseases.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Allen, President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research. I'd first like to thank Senator Bennet for those opening remarks and for your leadership in developing the breakthrough designation nearly a decade ago. Today, we have two terrific panels to discuss the role of expedited drug development tools and specifically exploring ways to optimize the breakthrough therapy designation. As science has rapidly progressed, so too have the methods used to develop and evaluate new medicines. Over the past several months, we've had the good fortune to work with numerous expert stakeholders to consider process enhancements for the next generation of new therapies. And thanks to all of you for joining today's meeting. I'm pleased to turn things over to Bea Lavery from Genentech Roche to lead our first discussion of the day. Bea?
Thank you, Jeff. I am Bea Lavery, and I am the Vice President and Global Head of Regulatory Oncology at Genentech and Roche. I have the honor today to moderate this first panel, and I'd like to briefly introduce my esteemed colleagues that are joining me today. I'll start with Martha Donohue. Martha is a pediatric oncologist, and she is the Deputy Director of the Division of Oncology 2 at FDA. She also serves as the Acting Associate Director of Pediatric and Rare Cancer Drug Development in the OCE, and she leads Project Beyond Breakthrough. Next, we have Tina Kim Kafkin. Tina is a Senior Director in Regulatory Affairs at Seagen Incorporated and has over 20 years of experience in drug development and regulatory in CMC and oncology. Next, we have Atik Rahman, who is the Director of the Division of Cancer Pharmacology 2 within the Office of Clinical Pharmacology at FDA. He's also involved with various outreach programs by the OCE and OCP. And we also have joining us Giuseppe Randazzo, who's the Director of US Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at Novartis Pharma. And prior to joining Novartis, Giuseppe was at the FDA for 15 years in roles across the Office of New Drugs, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, and the Office of Compliance. Before we begin, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes providing some context and background that led to this panel discussion. Starting with last year's 2020 Friends of Cancer Research Annual Meeting, where a white paper and a panel discussion was focused on the topic of modernizing expedited development programs. From these discussions, we discussed how programs such as breakthrough therapy could enable more dialogue and exchange between FDA and sponsors, allow for real-time problem solving, and actually could we codify these best practices. Following that annual meeting, Friends led a comprehensive review to identify opportunities to improve the implementation of the BTD program to fully realize its potential to facilitate expedited oncology drug development and to serve patients with cancer. From a broad sponsor survey, followed by a series of 10 discipline roundtable discussions with representatives from 20 sponsors and several review divisions across FDA, this led, under Friends' leadership, the development of the white paper that informs today's discussion. As outlined in the white paper, and as Ellen mentioned earlier, the benefits of the BTD program are clear with the timely approval of effective and novel products, as well as the shortening of approval timelines with a median of 2.3 years shortening compared to products without BTD. So over the last 9+ years since the inception of the BTD program, there's significant experience from the sponsors and FDA, which we then share in the white paper. The key points that we will discuss today are fourfold. Number one, clarifying the expectations for necessary evidence to grant BTD. Two, enhancing communication between sponsors and FDA, particularly in terms of proactively identifying and resolving issues in a timely manner. Three, supporting interdisciplinary coordination and improving transparency. And four, proactively addressing rate-limiting steps in drug development, such as dose selection and CMC-related issues. So our goal today is to dig a little deeper into these recommendations, share the perspectives that were shared during the roundtables, and actually crystallize some tangible next steps. So I'd like to start with my first question to Tina at Seagen. From a sponsor perspective and based on what you heard at the roundtable discussions, can you describe one or two less obvious benefits of the BTD program that should absolutely be maintained moving forward?
Thanks, Bea, and thanks to Friends for hosting this meeting today and for continuing to bring important stakeholders together to optimize development of cancer therapies through breakthrough designation. I think one of the less obvious ones, but maybe obvious to some, is the flexible and adaptable communication that BTD brings. And I think this is also a common theme that emerged in several of the roundtables, is really about communication with FDA, who, what, when, and how. And I think that having a personal background in RACMC as well as in the oncology therapeutic area, I deeply appreciate the ability that breakthrough designation allows for multidisciplinary, cross-functional communication, especially for new molecular entities that do require a full product quality review. Includes, aspects of inspection that does take time in our GMP facilities, and ways to address these so that the accelerated timelines that are often accompanied by BTD drugs are synergized such that it leads to a way of proactive planning and upfront communication such that we can prepare for a more smooth review when the application is actually submitted.
Thanks, Tina. And maybe I can then turn to Martha. So based on the original intent of BTD and the decade of experience that the agency now has, what do you think in terms of the most valuable aspects of BTD that you've learned? And then maybe what are some areas in which the application of the BTD was less valuable?
Thank you so much, Bea, and thank you again to Friends for bringing us all together here to reflect on our past experience and figure out what we can do moving forward to improve the process. I think breakthrough therapy designation has driven so many changes that have enhanced multiple aspects of drug development for BTD drugs that it's hard to focus on just a few. But I will call out a couple. I think the way we approach our view to product quality has really been impacted by breakthrough therapy, spanning from ways to facilitate more timely facility review, concurrent validation of drug substance and drug products, fostering availability of commercial products through procedures that allow importation of commercial product prior to approval. And we could go on and on. I think from a clinical standpoint, the ability to have more flexible, timely interactions to address complex aspects of drug development that I think are particularly important to rare cancers that involve, development of companion diagnostics, approaches to figure out how the data from a single patient, is fully maximized to get drug development moving forward is vital. And I think we really saw that realized over the past not quite decade when we look at things like the approval of tissue agnostic drugs, et cetera. So I think we've really realized quite a bit of improvement over time that's directly a result of breakthrough therapy designation. But I think most importantly, and I think reflected in our conversations and Tina's comments as well, is I think that it's been really an important impetus in having us shift as regulators in terms of what we view our role is, frankly, as a regulator, from one that is responsive to sponsors' interaction, questions, to more of a collaborative, proactive, creative problem-solving approach that we can now bring to bear through the interactions we have when we discuss drug development of BTD drugs. And I think that the changes have been so profound that they've trickled down even to non-BTD drugs. So I think that we've really realized quite a bit of change over the past less than decade or so. In terms of things that I think we can do better, I think we had a lot of discussion about when should breakthrough therapy designation be granted and how do we better provide advice to sponsors and encourage applications at the right time so that it's early enough for us to maximize the BTD features. So I think that that's something that we can think about doing a little bit better job of. I think we have really realized also that breakthrough therapy designation tends to have the most impact for original applications, not as much for supplements. So that's something for us to think about as well. And also in our haste to develop drugs that we think that are very exciting can make a big impact. I think we also need to not forget that there are other important aspects of drug development that we have to be sure occur at the right time, such as dose optimization. And so I think that's something that we need to think about in the future in terms of improvement of our processes. And so I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that as the afternoon goes on.
Thanks, Martha. And let's actually focus on that big theme of timely communication and how to enhance those interactions at the right time with the right people. So I'm going to turn to Giuseppe, who can provide a sponsor perspective, but also based on sitting in on the roundtable discussions. What specifically were the recommendations that we had to improve the interactions between the agency and sponsors for BTD products, but potentially could trickle beyond BTD?
Thanks. And I too want to take a moment to thank FOCR as well as other applicants, or excuse me, sponsors and the FDA for all the collaboration we've had in developing the document as well as this panel discussion. Great question. Well, I think what you'll see is often in the paper, you'll see early, frequent, and timely communications. And the idea here is what exactly does that mean? And also, not only what does it mean, how can we facilitate that? Meaning, we know the FDA, their review staff is incredibly busy. And sponsors and applicants are busy as well. So how can we develop something that we're communicating early, often, and frequent that works for both parties, works for FDA and works for industry? That's one thing. Another thing I think that's important to think about is alignment and enhanced communication among the centers. So I heard often in the panel conversations about, how can CDER and CDRH, for example, can they better align? They do a very good job, but can they even do a better job as far as going forward? Where one center maybe designated breakthrough has a breakthrough designation for a product, and they communicate early and often to CDRH, for example. And I'll add one more thing too. Along with that, the other center, of course, that's near and dear to our heart as far as CBER with cell and gene, for example, being complex products, there's conversations that has to be had there as well. And you've got two programs, of course, you got breakthrough designation and RMAT. So how can we work and the centers work together and, of course, communicate early and often? And, of course, maybe even consider best practices across the designations when it makes sense to consider those for whether it's CBER or CDER.
And Giuseppe, I'm going to pull a thread that you've thrown in here for the discussion. We talk about early and often, but one of the biggest issues is resource-intensive preparation on both the sponsor side, but also the review side by the agency that then receives large briefing packages and have a lot of information to digest. And that may not always be timely. So we had a lot of discussions in the roundtable. Can you speak to a little bit about the different kinds of ideas and topics? Because we saw kind of the whole gamut, right, of informal to formal. You want to talk a little bit about the interactions and the mechanisms that came up during the roundtables?
Sure, I can talk briefly about that. I think there's a few tools that are mentioned in the white paper, and the idea here is, I think without pulling out or naming an exact tool, I think can we figure out something that makes sense, once again, that's convenient and that's flexible enough for industry as well as FDA, that can be done rather quickly. And unfortunately too, we don't want it to become too I don't want to use the word formalized, because it will be a formal process to a degree. But as far as we don't want to slow the FDA down, nor do we want to slow industry down, because as we go through the process, once you have breakthrough designation, we've seen the pace and cadence of interactions can vary. So if we can have a tool that aligns not only disciplines to a degree, but also aligns the conversations, communications with FDA and sponsors and applicants, that would be great. As far as what that tool looks like, I don't think we know yet. But if we can figure out some tool, that'd be great.
And as in the white paper, we also see a description of the different formal interactions as well as potentially proposed new interactions as part of the DUFA that could be leveraged for the dialogue. But maybe I can turn to Atik now, who also sat in on some discipline-specific discussions as a reviewer in the clinical pharmacology division. Can you comment a little bit about your perspective, but also what you heard in terms of how the agency can also enhance their ways of working between the review divisions, and then also help with this transparency to sponsors to enable timely communications?
Good afternoon, and thanks, Bea, and thanks to FOCR for the invitation. From clinical pharmacology perspectives, breakthrough drug development program can be enhanced by having a clinical pharmacology specific and post BTD interactions with the sponsors. In the current format, we get to understand through a post designation meeting, mostly at the pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting, what clinical pharmacology studies have been completed, what are ongoing that will be included in the application for regulatory approval. Now, this has been helpful as clinical pharmacology review team and the sponsors come to an agreement on what kind of information that will be needed for clinical pharmacology review, and if approved, what kind of information can be included in the package insert. This also helps us to know what studies are ongoing and what studies need to be initiated as post-marketing requirement for inclusion of important information in the package insert that will optimize product use and help patient care. Now, however, I think with the dose optimization initiative through Project Optimus, ushered by the Oncology Center of Excellence, we need to have a pre-BTD meeting to discuss the rationale for the tested dosage and plan for optimization of dosage in the ongoing trials. Now, having said that, I understand that in many cases, this may be challenging, both from the sponsor side as well as from the FDA side. And in that case, I think we definitely need to have an immediate post-designation discussion on sponsors' rationale for dose selection for the subsequent regulatory trial. We would like to see a well-justified dose or doses that are tested in a clinical trial that will be submitted for full marketing applications. I think we need to move away from one dose fits all paradigm, especially for different indications where the benefit risks of the therapy may be different. And in that case, selection of dose will play a significant role. So I hope that gives you an understanding of what and how we can improve our communication from clinical pharmacology perspective between the sponsor and FDA.
And Atika, I think that's a really great case study example of a key discussion that actually would benefit from a much more timely, earlier dialogue. And also depending on the type of product, if it's a novel product in which, our classic dose paradigms don't make sense, it's really important to have that dialogue. And so maybe I'll ask Tina and Giuseppe. I'll start with Tina. From a sponsor perspective, we had representatives that ranged, every size and every experience of sponsors that have been through BTD. And I think from your own personal experiences, but also what you heard, there is a discomfort as to knowing when's the right time and how do you work and communicate with the agency, because we tend to be facing with the clinical review divisions as an example. Can you talk a little bit about some specific concerns or some barriers or resistance that we have to work through in order to solve these pain points? And so maybe Tina, I'll start with you and then Giuseppe.
Sure. I think maybe two dimensions that I'd like to bring up is something you mentioned, Bea, is the sponsor's experience with a BTD designation, having gone through the process and yielding a marketed approval, and kind of knowing what to expect in a general sense. And then those sponsors that might not have experienced it before, and this may range from the size of the company to also just experience in a smaller pipeline where you don't know what to expect and you really do need that guidance. And so I think both of those can yield experiences by which we want to make sure from the sponsor side that we're providing important information to FDA, and that usually yields data that is quite mature or less on a preliminary standpoint. We want to ensure that there is a message here. And so sometimes sharing preliminary information or data may be somewhat of a barrier that sponsors don't like to do, quite honestly. And so what I also heard from some of these roundtables was maybe not such a focus on data itself, but it's a roadmap. The sponsor and the FDA want to have transparency, and maybe that's more about the overall strategy. And some items that are not available yet are to be determined or to be discussed at a later date, but at least that is conveyed and communicated that is on the radar for something that needs to be done. So that is a cultural shift potentially to get sponsors more comfortable to share more information that provides kind of another layer or dimension of transparency that might be a tool for optimization.
Thanks. Yeah, I think well said. And I know we're running out of time for the first panel, so I'll make it quick. One thing I recall specifically from the panel conversation discussed, for example, about the pace and cadence of different disciplines, for example, from FDA and communicating to applicants or sponsors, and then vice versa, communicating back to the FDA. If there can be better alignment between the pace and cadence. So, for example, Dee, I think you mentioned about the clinical. So we might hear from the clinical side quite often. Are we hearing from other disciplines as often? We may not need to hear from them as often, but are we hearing from them often enough? And vice versa, once again, are we responding and having that proper communications back to the FDA? So if there can be better alignment between pace and cadence from the FDA to applicants and vice versa, I think that'll help and truly enhance the communication as this panel was here to discuss.
Thank you both. And one of the ideas that did come through the roundtables and was actually proposed in the white paper was this idea of a snapshot. And could it be something that this high level exchange of information, and there's an example in the appendix of the white paper for a dose snapshot. So maybe I'll ask Martha to kind of comment on, is this potentially a tangible next step that we could take forward, or based on what you heard, are there different ways that we could experiment with enhancing this ability of exchange of information at the right time that is less formalized, less resource intensive?
Thanks for the question, Dee. I am very excited about the snapshot idea. It was not my idea. It might have been your idea, actually, to have sort of a mechanism to really, in a relatively easy way, communicate high-level information that would be very important to kind of help decision-making throughout drug development, back and forth between FDA and sponsors, so that we know enough to be able to highlight certain pain points that might need to be addressed in a timely way, and also provide an avenue for discussion. So I absolutely think the snapshot idea is a great one. And I do think, to Tina's point about a cultural shift and the importance of, trying to break down some existing barriers to communication, I think that this could really go a long way towards that. And as we gain more experience with it, if we pilot it and gain experience, I think that might, provide a nice feedback loop whereby we can further improve the process. And I think as a first initial step, starting it with dosing might be a good step, and then considering whether we might want to apply it to other aspects of drug development. I think that we at FDA do understand that at the time of breakthrough therapy designation, the data are preliminary for many aspects of development, and just getting a high level view of what the sponsors would like to communicate with us would really help us all move forward together in a way that I think is best for everyone. So yes, I'm very excited about that, as well as the Type D meetings, which I think we're going to start doing, as well as those more focused meetings, which would hopefully be less burdensome to sponsors as well as to us.
And maybe just. Yeah, and on that last comment, so thank you I think there could be a lot of excitement and utility for something like a snapshot, anything to enable better communication. So, and that could also have utility beyond breakthrough. It could be leveraged before a sponsor has enough data to even apply for breakthrough. Maybe one last question to the sponsor representative. So would this be something you'd be willing to test as a sponsor rep, to start practicing and maybe piloting to enable this kind of practice? Oh, Giuseppe, I'll start with you.
Sorry, I had to unmute. My apologies. I think we'd have to learn more about it, right? I think it sounds like, you want to start off with dosing. I think we have to learn more about it. The conversation the panelists, for example, are definitely on board. I think before we can commit to doing something, we just have to learn more about it. But of course, always willing to talk with the FDA about it to see what it can look like, what it would look like.
Tina, any thoughts as well?
Well, I think in the spirit of forging ahead and trying to optimize processes for our cancer patients and potential therapies, CGen in the past hasn't been shy in participating in pilot programs. So I think that this would be something of potential interest for us to consider as things evolve. But that's why we're here today and sharing in our experiences to hopefully move forward and making things more effective.
Well, thank you all. I think we are short on time, so I wanted to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank Friends and the FDA representatives, as well as all of the sponsor reps that provided input, not only in this meeting and the white paper, but also in the roundtable discussions. I think we have a lot of exciting ideas that we could take forward, and I think that together we can try to pilot some new ideas to enhance the program. Thank you for all your feedback, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
Thanks so much, Bea. Thank you to the panel for a great discussion and to all the representatives that participated in the roundtables throughout this project. If you haven't had a chance to read the full paper distributed prior to the meeting, I would certainly encourage it. As you've heard from the panel already, it provides a number of different ideas to optimize timing and interactions into the future. Speaking of the future, to help us think through the role that expedited development programs can play in the future of drug development, I'd like to hand things off to Nick Florco from Stat News to lead our second discussion today. Nick?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Jeff, and thanks to Friends for hosting this panel. We have a lot to get to and not a lot of time, so I'm just going to jump right into introducing our guests. So first, we have Catherine Couvillon, who's a patient advocate. We have Dr. Sandra Horning, Professor of Medicine Emerita at Stanford University, who was formerly at Genentech and Roche. Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, the President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And Dr. Rick Pazder, the Director of the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. And so we heard a lot during the last panel about one expedited pathway in particular, of course, breakthrough designation. Now I want to broaden the discussion a bit more to talk about how all of the FDA's pathways can be modernized for the future so we ensure sustainability. So I want to hear first from the people who are most impacted by these pathways, the patients. And so I want to start with you, Catherine. And I want to ask, from your perspective, what is working and what isn't working with these pathways? And what personally would you like to see changed?
I don't know that I have suggestions on how the process can be improved. I just want to say thank you so much for coming up with these pathways. I was able to be the recipient of breakthrough therapy when I was first diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer 6 years ago. And that breakthrough therapy drug gave me 5 years without cancer progression, when I had originally seen that my life expectancy might only be 3 years. In the past year, however, I've gone through 4 different treatments, none of which have worked for me. So I just wanted to keep us all focused on the why. My friends, fellow patients, and I are just waiting for that next drug that is in the pipeline, hopefully. And so everything that can be done to expedite the pathways gives us so much more hope. And hopefully we'll get that drug before our time runs out.
Thank you for sharing that, Catherine. I appreciate it. I want to turn over to Michelle and Sandra, and I want to ask you both a similar question. What is working for industry and what can be improved? Whoever wants to take it away first, please go ahead. Don't be shy. I'll call. There we go. Okay.
Go ahead, Sandra. Well, I just want to say that from my perspective, I think the expedited pathways have been tremendously important for patients, for earlier access to promising new medicines. And I am very grateful to Congressman Bennet, FDA, and friends for the progress that we've made, and also applaud this opportunity to think about how we can further improve things. And, as we were thinking about breakthrough designation in particular, we had this concept of kind of all hands on deck when the clock was ticking away for patients to make things happen in an expedited fashion. And so this first panel and the emphasis on communication, I think, extends across the broad spectrum of expedited pathways. How can this be done in a more timely fashion that's less onerous, but also one where I would say that it's important to focus on the concept of dialogue, because this really is a two-way street, and understanding on both sides, the agency and sponsorship, and to that end, in addition to thinking about how we can further improve communication, I think it's what that communication is about. And often that goes straight to the levels of evidence that's going to be necessary for regulatory approval, the type and quantity of evidence, and bringing some of these concepts further into a clarified and transparent view, which I think would include the dosing that has been discussed by panel one. I think where real world evidence plays a role, and also some of these newer areas on generalizability and diversity inclusion. How does all that play into expedited pathways?
I completely agree with Sandra, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation. These pathways often get swept up in whatever the political dialogue is at the moment, but I think we should all take a step back, like Catherine asked us to do, and remember, as we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the embarkation of these pathways, that they were started because patients were protesting, trying to get access to life-saving therapies where there were none. And today, that is still the name of the game in these pathways. And it's so critically important that we do everything we can to get these new solutions and potential cures out the door. Now, to me, the name of the accelerated pathway category is a bit of an anathema because everyone in FDA is making a benefit risk calculation. And when there is a huge unmet medical need, it's very, very difficult to come up with a benefit risk ratio that makes sense. We have to offset the needs of patients with the potential risks and benefits of a new intervention. So it's incredibly important that reviewers have these pathways at their disposal to try to address those huge and imminent patient needs. When we talk about improving the pathways, that really goes in line with improving all of the work that FDA does. We need to think about how we modernize clinical trials, how we finally find a way to rely upon real-world evidence and get real-world data that we can rely upon out of the healthcare system. These are the things that would make it easier for reviewers to make those decisions in the accelerated pathway points. And it would also make it easier for reviewers to get post-market data to confirm their evidence after launch.
Rick, I want to bring you in here too and just ask how things are going for the FDA. I mean, part of this, the focus of this panel, of course, is ensuring sustainability. And we've seen a huge uptick in manufacturer interest in these various pathways. And I would assume applications are undoubtedly going to get more complex with the advent of next generation therapies. How is this all impacting the FDA's workload? And frankly, is the current workload sustainable?
Well, let me tell you this. I think when we take a look at all of the pathways, we have fast track, we have breakthrough, we have priority review, we have accelerated approval, we have RMAT. Should we try to simplify some of these pathways and really take a look rather at instead of all of these designations, which require a lot of time, try to simplify things and say, perhaps we should have kind of like an early breakthrough therapy designation and then a late breakthrough designation aimed at the review of the NDA rather than having a lot of duplicative programs here. As you know, the breakthrough therapy program Sponsor could submit it very early in drug development, or a sponsor could submit it at the time of NDA or BLA submission. And those interactions and the need for the sponsors vary dramatically depending on when they submit an application. So rather than taking a look at all of these different programs, perhaps we need to have some simplification and actually concentrate on what are the core messages of these programs. Because in addition to these programs, we also have other pathways that are not codified in regulation, such as the real-time review, Project Orbis, the simplification of our written documents under the assessment aid, et cetera, that are unique to oncology, but hopefully will be extended to other therapeutic areas.
I think this idea of streamlining and simplification is pretty interesting. I'm curious, anybody else on the panel, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I'm curious for anybody's thoughts on how that would work for both patients and both for sponsors.
I think it's high time to look at simplification. These decisions are on a spectrum. It's not like they're cut and dry. And all of the spectrum is about how you adjust the benefit risk ratio. So simplification would make it easier, I think, for patients and for sponsors as they're trying to pursue it. People sometimes mention that these pathways are more popular with sponsors as though that's a bad thing. But in effect, these were designed to do just that, to draw more innovators to these unmet needs. And that just means they're accomplishing their goal.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think simplification involves coordination, and that together with greater transparency and understanding among all the stakeholders, I think would be really helpful.
Nick, I think one of the issues that we have to bring out, these programs, whether one talks about Fast Track, which was kind of a predecessor many, many years ago, greater than 20 years ago, and then the most recent one, Breakthrough, they've developed over a historical period of time here, okay? Drug development has changed dramatically during the period of time. And to take a real clear understanding of what these pathways represent, keeping the essence of what is the true goal of these pathways, but simplifying the designations, I think, and clarifying it to the American public would mean a lot. I don't think if you ask even practicing physicians what all of these programs mean, that they would know. In fact, I think the only people that really know are people in regulatory departments of pharmaceutical firms. What are the different designations and what are the criteria for these designations? For example, Fast Track probably has very little meaning to people at this time. Yet we see sponsors asking for it. It takes up our bandwidth, so to speak, as far as time and energy, as far as designating these designations. So a simplification of the process, cognizant of the fact that these have had a historical history or a history that has spanned now almost 25 years, I think is warranted and actually would be better for everyone, clearer communications, and still keeping the goal of getting these drugs when they are breakthrough therapies out as quickly as possible. And that can happen without a lot of the unnecessary paperwork and duplication of this letter and that letter. And if you got this designation, could you get this designation? It becomes almost a chess game for, I think, the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA of who has what and what move is next.
Catherine, I'm curious for your perspective. How would simplification, do you think, impact the patient community?
Well, I would hope that that simplification would also include some simplification in the data elements that are required for the sponsors to collect from the people participating in the clinical trials. I've been in a number of clinical trials myself, and the extra appointments that I have to attend, the extra testing I have to have done, when I'm getting ready to start these clinical trials, I may have to go down to the cancer center every day of the week for some different hoop that I have to jump through and some specific timing that they want. And being a former data analyst, I understand we need to have robust data. We need to have continuity of data collection, but there puts a great burden on the patients to have to do a lot of additional things that they wouldn't have to do if they didn't choose to participate in the clinical trials. And we don't want to disincentivize people from participating because otherwise, how are we ever going to get any new drugs?
And Catherine's point is particularly important if we're going to diversify our trials, which is one of the areas that is so critically important in this space and others. So we need to do everything we can to meet patients where they are and meet their needs better than we are today.
I'd just like to follow up on Michelle's comment, and that is we are asking sponsors, and this is especially important for breakthrough therapy designations, to have that discussion about what is their plan for diversification in the clinical development program. Many times we look at diversification and equity issues in the pivotal trial, and I would like to point out, too late. We need to start that from the beginning when patients are first entered on those phase 1 studies and even earlier in preclinical studies, looking, are there potential for genetic ethnic differences? But the spectrum of drug development has to encompass the concept of racial diversity and representation of underrepresented minority groups. And I think we are, particularly in oncology, emphasizing that in our breakthrough discussions with patients and with sponsors, rather.
I don't want to cut off this really important discussion, but I want to just move on to another topic since we have a very limited amount of time. I want to address sort of the elephant in the room. When we're talking about sustainability, there's been a tremendous amount of talk in the press and in the public, particularly around accelerated approval and some backlash there, spurred partially at least by the FDA's decision to approve the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm through the accelerated approval pathway. Dr. Pazder, I know you famously said in July that you thought the pathway was under attack, and I'm curious, do you still feel that way, and how are you feeling about the fate of the pathway now?
I think there is room for improvement in the pathway. I've publicly stated this. Here again, I am always open for reanalyzing pathways and where we're at a particular time. I think that many good things have come from the accelerated approval pathway. They've expedited drugs, very important drugs, to the American public. So I think it is a very important pathway that we have. Other international regulators have taken this on. They call it a conditional approval, which has some minor modifications. They don't talk about surrogacy and many of these other issues, surrogate endpoints. They simply address risk-benefit relationships. I think the major thing that could happen to improve this program, and here again is something that we want to hone in, especially as we talk about breakthrough designations, which many of these drugs would have, is really a very early comprehensive discussion with the sponsor on what is their entire package for accelerated approval. Frequently, we find sponsors that kind of stumble on a finding and they say, aha, I want to do accelerated approval. Well, really, we really have to have a discussion on what is going to be your confirmatory study, when is it going to be submitted in relationship to that accelerated approval, how many patients are going to be entered on that confirmatory study before accelerated approval is granted. When we take a look at problematic accelerated approvals, these have generally focused on studies that did not have confirmatory studies ongoing at the time of accelerated approval. So this picture that I want to paint is an early discussion of what constitutes the entire package for accelerated approval. And I think that's one of the major issues that I'd like to get across here.
Well, since you brought up confirmatory trials, that's actually the next thing that I wanted to address in this panel. I wanted to spend a few minutes sort of unpacking one of the biggest concerns or complaints we hear, which is that manufacturers don't ever complete follow-up studies that are supposed to be done, or they do them later than folks would like. And Catherine, I wanted to get your perspective here first. I'm curious sort of if you could explain to us sort of what is the value of those studies? I mean, to put the question kind of crudely, does it matter to patients how quickly these trials are done and whether they're done at all, just so we can set this discussion off?
I don't want to speak for every patient, but for me in particular, and my friends who were on the breakthrough therapy that I was on, every time they would update the time to progression data as they were ongoing, collecting the data as patients were living, so much longer than they had originally expected, to see that get bumped out, from 24 months to, 26 months to whatever it ended up being, it gives us a lot of hope. We kind of wait with bated breath to see what the next report is going to say. And the people that are not yet on those drugs, that's the data that they look at. So you want to have the most up-to-date data to know if you're making an informed decision on which treatment you'll do next. Because sometimes specific treatment might then preclude you from taking a later treatment. And if you make a decision, it could impact your entire future of care. And you want to do that with the most data that you have.
Sandra, I want to bring you in here. What's your take on why sometimes these trials don't get done or they get done slowly? And what should be done to help make sure manufacturers do complete these trials?
Yeah, maybe just stepping back, I prefer the term optimizing rather than reforming because I think there has been, so much good that has come out of the expedited programs. And I also would really endorse what Rick has said, which is about having that plan early and that we can see light at the end of the tunnel as to when it could be confirmed. So when we think about when some of these studies have been delayed, I think first look at the data. Overall, I think there's a reasonable record of studies actually being completed, particularly for breakthrough designation, but also for accelerated approval. And if there's a a misconception about that, then how can we clear that record? But when you ask why, I think that, there are a variety of reasons. One thing is we're always dealing with a changing standard of care. And whether those studies can be conducted in a timely fashion. The sooner that they're conceived of and ongoing, the more likely it is that they will be completed in a timely fashion. And I also think that we need to be thinking about this as a partnership. If they're not being completed, then why is that? And how can we together assist in that being done? Some, I think, regular updating and reporting of the status of these confirmatory trials, might also help boost the confidence in the overall program, but also in our ability to learn and complete these trials in a timely fashion.
Rick, I know you're known for, frankly, straight talk towards industry sometimes. So I'm curious for your take on how is this actually a problem for the FDA in terms of getting manufacturers to complete trials? And if so, I'm curious, what additional power does the FDA need to get companies to live up to those commitments?
Well, it varies between sponsors and between indications. Okay, to say, make a generalized statement would be very unfair. What we saw with the PD-1 drugs, and many of these firms were very well-established, big pharmaceutical companies, they had a lot of trials ongoing. They were totally invested in developing PD-1 drugs. So they had multiple drugs or multiple trials being conducted. So as you saw in our meetings that we had regarding these dangling accelerated approvals, there were several trials that could have confirmed the accelerated approval of an indication. So it really varies between sponsor to sponsor, between indication to indication. We have to have some authority over this, and this is one of the other areas that may need to be looked at as far as what is the definition. These trials are supposed to be done with due diligence. I'll give you the Dr. Pazder definition of due diligence, and that is with the same resources, speed, etc., that a company would exert in doing their pivotal trial for registration. No company, no major pharmaceutical company, or even a small biotech company would take 5 or 6 or 10 years to do a trial that could be done in 1 or 2 years. That's for sure.
So we only have about a minute left, but I want to end on a forward-looking note, and I want to do a very, very quick lightning round. I'm just going to ask each person that if you had a magic wand and there was one thing you could improve about the FDA's expedited pathways, what would it be? And Michelle, I'm going to start with you if I could.
Well, mine is more about public awareness. I would hope that everyone would get more aware of how surrogate endpoints are used both in traditional approvals and in accelerated approvals, and make sure that we get more data about how these endpoints actually correspond to patient outcomes sooner and faster.
Sandra?
Michelle said it well, but I think having greater transparency in how decisions are made for expedited development with a real focus on endpoints and surrogacy, and a greater understanding among all stakeholders on this.
Catherine?
I'd just like to see more involvement of patients. I really appreciate the opportunity to be included here. And I would like to say that I don't think that you would talk to a recipient of a breakthrough therapy drug who would regret taking it. We are all very thankful to have any opportunity for something to hope in.
And Rick, I'm going to give you the last word. One thing you'd like to see improved.
This is easy. Get rid of the excessive bureaucracy within the FDA and within drug companies, and let's focus on patients.
All right, well, we're going to end it there. Thank you all for a great panel discussion, and now I'm going to hand it back over to Jeff.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to all of our speakers today. We very much appreciate your insights and continued leadership. I'd like to thank all of the people that helped move this project forward, all of the working group participants over the last several months that contributed to developing the paper, our colleagues at the FDA for their willingness to share their expertise, and the team at Friends of Cancer Research that led the development of the paper for today's event and in coordinating everything that you've joined us for today. And thanks to all of you for joining us for today's discussion. Please keep an eye out for our future events, including our annual meeting in early November. It will be virtual, address several cutting-edge topics, and we hope that you'll join us then. Until then, take care and thank you.